Folks, I would like to introduce you to two very important words at work in our society today, as they were in the biblical world: heteroloquy and ortholoquy. Heteroloquy means any way of communicating that upsets, or at least threatens to upset, an institutionalized way of communicating. This can and does occur through goods and nonverbal behavior. It is dissidence and subversiveness, socially disorienting heterodoxy and deviant behavior. Ortholoquy, any way of communicating, whether it be spoken, written, with goods, or nonverbal action, in terms of the institutionalized ideology. Ortholoquy is the usual way of social interaction, the received way of expressing received views. Corresponding received views mean social orthodoxy. Corresponding behavior based on these received views means social orthopraxy. For example, it is not against our Western social script to be anti-Arab and anti-Muslim. These prejudices are acceptable in our society, even if we don't admit it.
So listen, you have family in Gaza, your wife's family, your in-laws are there, right?
Yes.
And tell me, can you talk to them?
No, I've been touring, so it's been difficult. It's been difficult enough for them to be in touch with my wife and her family. But the thing is, they have many families there, like cousins and uncles, and they're all left their houses in Khan Yunis and Gaza and northern Gaza. And now they are in one apartment, in one building in Rafah, sharing it with 25 other families. And at any moment we can hear a bomb drop. But it's okay because Israel will apologize, I'm sure, as they usually do. I was so happy to listen to their sincere apology for killing the people from Central Kitchen. Oh my God, the pain that they have to go through. Even one of their spokesmen tweeted on Twitter, it's like, see what Hamas made me do. It is so interesting. And the thing is, what's very interesting is the outrage, the global outcry. It's like, oh, how could you do that, Israel? But we forget James Miller, a British filmmaker that was also killed by Israeli snipers. We forget Tom Hartland, which he was also a British activist who's killed in the head. We forget Shireen Abu Aqla, the American-Palestinian reporter. It's like every time it's like, oh, Hamas did it. Oh, we did it. We're so sorry. Let's continue. There's no accountability. And I know, and I say it everywhere I go, if Israel today ended the war, they will be actually praised. It's like, thank you so much for not killing more Palestinians. Maybe they even give a Nobel Peace Prize to Netanyahu. This will happen, this will actually happen. Israel will be praised. There will be absolutely no accountability of what they did in Gaza for the past 6 months. This is what pains me. It's not like at the ending of the war. It's like after the war. It's like nothing they have done.
They're so acceptable that this horrific injustice is not railed against by many who call themselves pro-life and who champion freedom of religion, or by those who claim to care about social justice and stand up for things like human rights and democracy. Just look at how the New York Times, hardly a conservative paper, handles the war in Gaza.
Internal New York Times documents obtained by The Intercept show that the paper actually distributed an internal memo to its journalists that urged them to avoid using words like ethnic cleansing or genocide in describing the ongoing war on Gaza. And believe it or not, the memo gets even worse. So the Times instructed journalists covering Israel's war on the Gaza Strip to restrict the use of the terms genocide and ethnic cleansing and to avoid using the phrase occupied territory when describing Palestinian land. But it's occupied territory.
By every definition and by every standard. The United Nations and every other organization calls it occupied territories. But the New York Times has decided that if they call it occupied territories, it might mean that the occupation is wrong. And they would never want their readers to think something that is true. They want their readers to think that Israel is right, whether it actually is or not.
What is essential to heteroloquy? This: cognitive disorientation of true believers. For example, introduce nuance in the abortion debate and watch what happens. Outraged hostility gets produced among the faithful of both extreme sides.
allowed to steal it, يا عمي.
Or imagine calling Israeli settlers, that would be ortholoquy, squatters.
Yaakov, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
It's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
you are stealing my house.
Or occupiers. Watch how people would react to that if you did that. Imagine calling the Israeli military the IDF, or Israeli Defense Force, which is ortholoquy, rather an army of brutal occupation, heteroloquy. Or Nazis, heteroloquy. Or genocidal ethnic cleanser, heteroloquy. Watch what happens when you introduce heteroloquy, cognitive disorientation of true believers.
Occupation is an ongoing criminal act of war crimes after war crimes, and we are not willing to continue to take part in these war crimes. As a child in Israel, you are being brought up in a very strong Zionist militaristic education. You don't know almost anything about Palestine. You don't know about the Nakba in 1948. You don't know about the ongoing oppression. I realized during the Second Intifada that what the Israeli Air Force and the Israeli military is doing is a war crime, terrorizing a population of millions of Palestinians. And when I realized that, I decided to not just leave, but to organize other pilots that will publicly refuse to take part in these crimes.
Look, as Anna gives you the details here, reported by internal New York Times staffers, okay? Keep in mind, is this what an objective news organization would do? Because they claim, oh, we're the most objective. I mean, unless you're Palestinian, in which case you're dirt. You should stay occupied. And we're not even gonna use language that is accurate because you don't deserve it. You're not really a human being like those beloved Israelis.
It gets worse. So the memo also instructs reporters, I think this is the worst part, not to use the word Palestine except in very rare cases, and to steer clear of the term refugee camps to describe areas of Gaza historically settled by internally displaced Palestinians who fled from other parts of Palestine during previous Israeli-Arab wars. No, I mean, this is just literally concealing the reality from their readers and skewing their reporting so there's like overwhelming bias that favors one side.
Imagine if you called the land of Israel, ortholoquy, seen as a return, ortholoquy, a land to which Jewish people are indigenous, ortholoquy, by the way, despite these genetic studies, which can be found in any library of the world. And you'll note that there are Israeli geneticists who worked on these studies. And despite the solid history of this professor, who's an Israeli professor at history, imagine if you call the land of Israel, ortholoquy, seen as a return, ortholoquy, instead as occupied Palestine, heteroloquy. What would happen to the true believers? How would they react to that?
I never ask myself who lived before us here. It's very strange, you see. I think, by the way, that they leave the beds. I think. But I cannot be honest to be sure. I remember that we arrived here, we had beds. You understand it?
Or imagine calling Zionism, which means something good like the belief that Jewish people deserve a land, for what it really is, which is the desire for an ethnocracy that is genocidally racist to Palestinians. Heteroloquy. You see, what makes heteroloquy is the language used that shakes up the true believers. It deviates from the institutionalized legitimization of the discourse within which the discourse gets voiced. The result is that established power relations become threatened by heteroloquy.
The media misinforms us in a lot of ways, and it keeps us in a bubble that totally hides or shields us from one half of the argument, one side of the argument. And so when you come across people who might be just overwhelmingly supportive of everything the Israeli government does, if it's just a normal person, a normal civilian, right? Try to take it easy on them and try to have an actual good faith exchange with them, because they might not know about the full extent of this conflict or the historical context of this conflict, especially if they're relying on the paper of record, the New York Times, which is obviously skewing their reporting to overwhelmingly favor one side.
They skew things and they take their position, which is often on most issues a pro-corporate, pro-status quo position, and they privilege it and call it objective. Think about what an amazing trick that is. So now my corporate position is the objective position, and if anyone disagrees with the status quo, you're radicals and wrong by definition, because I define my position as the objective one. And here in the case of Israel, they're saying when Palestinians attack, as we'll get to the details in a second, we're to call them terrorists and all these terrible ways they use slaughter and massacre. When Israel attacks and kills more civilians, both as a ratio of civilians to combatants, and of course, overall raw numbers, much more than the terrorists, do not ever call them terrorists.
Just imagine, right? When somebody says Black Lives Matter, immediately this triggers the true believers into vigilantism mode. All lives matter! See? In their privilege, you've shaken up their world, and now they have to defend the established power relations. They have to protect it because you've introduced cognitive disorientation in these true believers. You didn't say that all lives don't matter or that only some lives matter. You said that the lives being trounced upon and treated like garbage, like filth, deserve to be respected. You said Black Lives Matter. And notice the reality, the exposure that for many people, unfortunately, in privilege, Black lives don't matter, folks. And so they shout, all lives matter, as a reaction. That's the power of heteroloquy.
In favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/312, please raise their hand. Those against? Thank you. Abstentions?
This would be way better. It wouldn't have the Nakba, etc. It would just say Palestine is a state like any other state. They don't get to drive the Jews out of their villages, etc., as happened in the creation of Israel. They don't get to do anything wrong or illegal. We're doing the same thing we did for Israel, but actually way more fair. But for the leaders, they say they're worried about terrorism, then they turn around and go, no, I don't want them to do it through diplomacy either. Okay, so you won't let them do it through peaceful actions. You won't let them do it through diplomacy. You won't let them do it in the same exact way you did it. And then you won't. And when they do violence, you go, "Oh, dirty terrorists! We have to kill 33,000 of them." Wait, they're not the terrorists. They're the children and the moms and stuff. Who cares? Kill them all because they're no good terrorists. They won't do anything peaceful, but they're doing something peaceful right now. They're applying through the UN just like you guys did. Shut them up, America.
Address what the protesters raised earlier. Is Israel committing genocide in Gaza?
Senator Cotton, we don't have any evidence of genocide being created.
So that's a no. Israel's not committing genocide in Gaza.
We don't have evidence of that.
Consider everything we've just said concerning the United States' established legitimate discourse on how the Israeli state is, especially right now with the situation with Iran, or especially the situation with Gaza and the Palestinians for now 7.5 decades.
And it's not about criticizing Israel at large or for existing or any of those things. What it is right now we have a right-wing neocon government in Israel that says, I'm going to start multiple wars. I'm going to kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians. I'm going to starve 1 million Palestinians. And now you're going to have to pay for all of it. Why? Guys, the answer is super obvious, unless you're corrupt. Okay? And I'm sorry, but if you're mainstream media and you're not reporting about the $100 million AIPAC is going to spend in this next election in regards to these stories, not just generically, hey, I mentioned it once, but hey, why is Biden doing what he's doing? Why is Mike Johnson and Hakeem Jeffries, why are they all doing what they're doing? Because of the money, Lebowski. It's so obvious. It's deeply embarrassing and humiliating. If you're in mainstream media and you're not talking about the number one reason why American politicians defy the American people overwhelmingly want a ceasefire, and the American politicians say no. Why do you think that is? Because they think it's more moral to kill all those people? More moral to start a disastrous war that absolutely no one in America wants? No, because the largest donor Joe Biden has ever had in his career is AIPAC, $11.2 million. Mike Johnson's top donor in this last campaign cycle, AIPAC. Hakeem Jeffries, leader of the Democrats in the House, he now says, I'm going to vote with Mike Johnson. The same guy they were calling MAGA Mike and a radical right-winger, now all of a sudden Hakeem Jeffries says he's got the entire Democratic Party's support. Why? Because he said not only $14 billion for Israel, $26 billion for Israel, total green light, bomb anyone you like, and America will pay for it. America second. And Hakeem Jeffries is like, yes, where's my money? Joe Biden's like, yes, where's my money? If you say that $11 million isn't relevant, Hakeem Jeffries has taken over $300,000. If you say that's not relevant, that he doesn't care about his top donor, you're absolutely positively lying. Of course they care about their donors.
I attended their annual conference, which drew 18,000 supporters and every major presidential candidate except for Bernie Sanders. I got to hear pro-Israel messaging that was so strong, facts didn't even seem to matter. What did they say about that?
We don't consider it occupation.
The glimpse I got of the AIPAC machine in action was as fascinating as it was frightening. Here's why. First, the pandering of our presidential candidates was so intense, you'd think they were running for office in Israel.
America can't ever be neutral when it comes to Israel's security or survival.
America will stand unapologetically with the nation of Israel.
I'm a newcomer to politics, but not to backing the Jewish state.
Even though he previously said he would be neutral on the question of Israel and Palestine, Trump totally flipped the script at AIPAC and basically regurgitated their talking points. And he even prepared a speech for once.
When I become president, the days of treating Israel like a second-class citizen will end on day one.
Nothing quite got standing ovations at AIPAC like slamming the Iran deal. This is a deal that AIPAC lobbied hard against and spent millions trying to defeat, yet failed. When questioned outside the conference, AIPAC supporters said things like this.
At the end of the day, the deal did pass.
But inside, it was a different story.
On the first day in office, I will rip this catastrophic Iranian nuclear deal to shreds.
Another popular way to rally the crowd was by dehumanizing Palestinians and blaming them for the absence of peace.
Palestinian children are raised in a culture that glorifies martyrdom and the willingness to die in the pursuit of killing or maiming Israelis.
What I didn't hear was basic context, like the fact that Israel has kept more than 4 million Palestinians under a military occupation for decades, or that Israel continues expanding settlements on Palestinian land in violation of international law and long-standing U.S. policy. Those realities weren't criticized as major impediments to peace at all. Attendees kept saying they supported peace between Israelis and Palestinians, but strangely weren't really ready to talk about Israel's actions in the region. Lastly, AIPAC's 3-day conference ended with a massive lobbying effort. Literally hundreds of Americans were bussed to Capitol Hill to urge their elected officials to keep supporting Israel.
Our purpose is to talk about Israel.
Nothing specific to your communities there.
Nothing specific to our communities.
Even high schoolers were assigned AIPAC talking points.
AIPAC has like its 3 goals. So personally, I'm talking on the first topic, which is about like Iranian aggressions.
AIPAC's message to U.S. politicians is simple: support Israel and we'll support you. Unlike other strong lobbies, they're effective. The U.S. gives Israel more than $3 billion of military aid each year, which Israel uses to advance its interests, even when they contradict our own. But seeing the lobby in action firsthand left me asking, is this how American democracy should work?
See how heteroloquy in these matters would affect Zionist Israelis or many types of United States fundamentalist Bible Christians. They would find such heteroloquy to be disorienting. And they would label such heteroloquy hatred of Israel, hatred of Jews, and anti-Semitic.
These are anti-Semites, anti-Israel, pro-terrorist elements out there, and we need to stop calling them peace activists. They are not peace activists. Peace activists do not cheer massive attacks against other countries, which is what they were doing yesterday.
And they would call it anti-Semitic behavior. See?
Prophetically, we are on the verge of the Gog-Magog war that Ezekiel described in chapters 38 and 39. The Democrats are trying to advise Israel to de-escalate, which is music to the ears of Hamas and Iran. We don't need to de-escalate. Hamas started a war murdering Jewish people. Hamas needs to be wiped out, period. You know, the providential timing of God is an awesome thing. Early in the week, when I began to feel the way this was going, I told our Christians United for Israel organization, we're going to have a Washington, D.C. fly-in. This is an emergency fly-in. That means you fly in one day, instantly, and have a meeting with Congress. After the service today, I'm going to get on a plane and fly to Washington, D.C. 250 more leaders from across the nation are going to converge there also. We're going to go to face the House of Representatives face to face and tell them to stop shuffling papers and actually do something to help Israel. God structured this in just a way that the door is now open and we're going to go through it like a bulldozer, I assure you that.
So I read into a lot of the Christians United for Israel, that's Hage's organization. So number one, do you know that they raise $100 million annually, every single year, and hand it over to Israeli groups? And so some of those are that help the settlers, that drives even more violence and more conflict. And second of all, they do these fly-ins all the time. Like if you and I did a fly-in to DC, it would be hilarious because almost no legislator would meet with us.
We don't have money.
Because we don't have money, right? But these Christians United for Israel fly in all these pastors and they all come in. I think that they're like literally the most, they're almost escaped mental patients, right? They come in their outfits and they're like, Gog Magog, listen to us, Gog Magog is coming. And then they're like, yeah, by the way, here's a check. And all the politicians are like, all right, Gog Magog it is. Who do you want us to murder? Okay. And so and unfortunately, when they do these fly-ins, they have a track record of enormous success because they come packing money and what the politicians believe is a lot of evangelical voters.
Heteroloquy can even provoke establishment-sanctioned violence. Cognitive certitude has to be restored, and the outrage must be assuaged.
Turns out that Republican Senator Tom Cotton does not believe it should take a long time to rid cities of pro-Palestinian protesters who have been blocking traffic in major cities. Now, his solution is to allow for ordinary citizens to engage in violence, to meet these protesters with violence. And if you think I'm exaggerating in my interpretation of what he said, well, why don't you hear it for yourselves?
If something like this happened in Arkansas on a bridge there, let's just say I think there'd be a lot of very wet criminals that have been tossed overboard, not by law enforcement, but by the people whose road they're blocking. If they glued their hands to a car or the pavement, well, probably pretty painful to have their skin ripped off. But I think that's the way we'd handle it in Arkansas. And I would encourage most people anywhere that get stuck behind criminals like this, who are trying to block traffic, to take matters in their own hands. There's only usually a few of them, and there's a lot of people being inconvenienced. It's time to put an end to this nonsense.
And by the way, he's like, oh, you know what we're doing in Arkansas? Yeah, I know, Tom, what you would do in Arkansas. When you talk about ripping people's skin off, you used to do that back in the day in Arkansas with a whip. So this is the worst possible way of treating the situation down. The country's already in a tinderbox situation.
Yeah.
We've got, giant percentages of Republicans and a significant percentage of Democrats and independents saying that it might be time for violence. So Tom Cotton comes out here and goes, do it, do the violence. He's a piece of crap. He's one of the worst guys in Congress. He's loathsome. Now, what's he worried about here? Why does he think you should do physical violence against one another? Because of gridlock, because the roads are, blocked up and everybody's frustrated. Wait, there's another kind of gridlock we're frustrated by. Congressional gridlock. The whole country is very, very frustrated by it. The left wing, right wing, everybody is. So should we do violence against congressional members, senators, because we're frustrated by gridlock? My answer is no, do not do that. But when it comes to Tom Cotton, he says, if you see a left-wing protester, or the worst thing ever for a US senator, a pro-Palestinian protester. I mean, they didn't even take money from AIPAC. Do violence! But when it comes to him, how dare you, right? So this is the kind of liar, hypocrite, disgusting fascist that Tom Cotton is. Yes, when you have government officials saying, I want my side to be brown shirts and go physically assault the other side, that is a definition of a fascist. That's who Tom Cotton is.
Some of the direct challenges Jesus gave his enemies were insulting, provocative of lifelong violent retribution, blood feud. Jesus was a Middle Eastern master of nasty insults. We try to tone him down by translating what he said as brood of vipers. But what he actually said was snake bastards. Those illegitimate sons of snakes, incapable of speaking anything but evil, and evil to the core. Now, despite the violence earned through those statements, none of these challenges to the honor of Jesus' enemies are examples of heteroloquy. Because nasty insults though they are, they do not really disturb the prevailing social ideology. But don't let that fool you into thinking that Jesus did not employ heteroloquy. When Jesus says your sins are forgiven, mind you, peasant nothing person Jesus becomes a folk healer authorized by God to forgive sins, to heal the sick, imitating knowledge of God's activity, you can rest assured that Jesus is doing heteroloquy. Jesus' statement to Galilean peasants, degraded and expendables, how honorable are you, the poor? This heteroloquy tears into the prevailing social discourse where only elites are the ones that everybody knows are obviously the only divinely approved ones. That's how it always is with elites, isn't it? It was likewise heteroloquy for later Jesus group preachers to summarize their interpretations of Jesus' sayings and parables with the all-purpose punchline point. But many that are first will be last, and the last first. A statement that, if taken seriously, would overturn the entire social fabric of the first century Mediterranean world. I mean, even today in our society, can you imagine if we actually took seriously and applied many that are first will be last and last first? How would people who are the first, like these people, how would they react to that? If you seriously applied it, they'd do social violence to you. Folks, they would do violence to you to restore the social order and to control the power structure in the social discourse. Don't think only conservatives. No. Those on the left would also. When Jesus advised that social reconciliation has precedence over temple sacrifice, that was likewise Jesus practicing heteroloquy. Heretics like Jesus, and Jesus was the patron saint of heresy and blasphemy. Heretics like Jesus are dissidents that speak the same language of the prevailing social discourse, and therefore can be and are understood by their peers and enemies. Now, when I say that they can be easily understood by their peers and enemies, that doesn't mean American Bible readers living in the 21st century, whether you're an atheist reading Jesus or a catechist reading Jesus, if you're in the 21st century, except through great efforts on our parts, the Middle Eastern Jesus cannot be understood by 21st century Western Christians or non-Christians. And although that's true, nevertheless, he very readily could be and was understood by his contemporaries. Heretics, and the heretic named Jesus was no exception, employ heteroloquy. And heresy is just one type of heteroloquy.
So there's more. Let's go to what the memo reads verbatim. It is accurate to use terrorism and terrorist in describing the attacks of October 7th, which included the deliberate targeting of civilians in killings and kidnapping. We should not shy away from that description of the events or the attackers, particularly when we provide context and explanation. But as you alluded to earlier, Cenk, the same phrasing is not to be used against what Israel is carrying out against Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The Times does not characterize Israel's repeated attacks on Palestinian civilians as terrorism, even when civilians have been targeted. And by the way, they have also referred to some of what Israel has done as massacres. An Intercept analysis found that as of November 24th, the New York Times had described Israeli deaths as a massacre on 53 occasions, and those of Palestinians just once. The ratio for the use of slaughter was 22-1, even as the documented number of Palestinians killed climbed to around 15,000 people. One anonymous source at the Times also told the Intercept this: I think it's the kind of thing that looks professional and logical if you have no knowledge of the historical context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But if you do know, it will be clear how apologetic it is to Israel. So that's someone who works within the New York Times newsroom who spoke to the Intercept for this story.
Yeah, so look, now Israel has killed 30 times the number of innocent civilians that Hamas has. And by the way, their kill ratio of combatant to civilians is worse than Hamas, because everybody leaves this out. Hamas actually killed over 300 IDF soldiers on October 7th. Now, that's not to say like that's a positive thing. No, I don't want anyone dying, including the IDF soldiers, okay? So, and I think October 7th was terrible. It was wrong morally, strategically, in every way that you could imagine. So I'm super clear about it, right? And so, but when you don't mention, hey, that was a 2.5:1 ratio, it's still way more civilians. The 2.5 is the civilians. Terrible, we all agree it's terrible. Now you turn around to Israel and their ratio is way worse than 2.5-1. But the New York Times says, no, that is not terrorism because Israel's doing it. So by definition, it must be morally correct, I guess. I mean, you tell me, New York Times, what's your excuse? They have a worse ratio. If you're saying Hamas are obviously dirty terrorists, because look at all the civilians they killed along with the Israeli soldiers. So now when Israel kills way more civilians as a ratio, along with the Hamas fighters they're theoretically killing, although they've never really proven it, you say they are not terrorists. There's no excuse for that, none, other than we love Israel, and loving Israel and letting them do anything they want is the objective position.
What makes a statement heretical is its ability to produce in the true believers a cry of deeply offended, outraged hostility. And the result? Just like people get canceled today for their heteroloquy, in the past, heteroloquy triggered outrage, leading to vindictive persecution of the heretic, someone who was then literally or figuratively burned at the stake. a collective response was invoked that sometimes led the community to betray, although always in the name of collective unity, the very principle that was at stake in the first place. You see, the so-called deviant, the one labeled heretic, has somehow triggered the true believers, and they sense that in some way their innermost self has been violated, their moral values usurped, and their very existence as a moral community placed into dire jeopardy. Ortholoquy gets rewarded, but heteroloquy, in contrast, is punished. Just look what has happened to Dr. Bruce Molina after his death. See, if Jesus was accused of dissidence, of heteroloquy, then he must have violated the innermost self of his opponents. Their reaction indicates that Jesus usurped their moral values and placed their existence as a moral community in jeopardy. Same thing with Dr. Bruce Molina, who was outspoken and dared to criticize the genocidally racist Israeli state, who dared to overturn its nationalist mythology for what it is, balderdash and poppycock. So what do you do with Dr. Bruce Molina? You cancel him. The true believers attempt the same institutional violence against Noam Chomsky for making the same criticisms against the Israeli state. And the same is attempted against British-Israeli historian Dr. Avi Shlaim for also making the same scathing commentary. And the same gets attempted against Israeli historian Dr. Shlomo Sand for criticizing likewise. And the same is attempted against Israeli-American geneticists like Dr. Eran Halhayek, whose scientific research shows convincingly the utter falsehood of Israeli claims at so-called Jewish DNA. See? This is always the way it works. Heteroloquy provokes establishment violence. Heteroloquy is a dissident way of speaking about the world and its value objects that causes outrage in some hearers. Threatened, institution authority figures enjoying prominence in a community must label such heteroloquy as discordant discourse, as being deviant. In the case of Dr. Bruce Molina, anti-Semitic, the pan-Israeli put-down. In the cases of Noam Chomsky, Avi Shlaim, Shlomo Sand, and Eran Halhayek, well, they get labeled self-hating Jews. See? In this way, the labeled heteroloquy becomes an attack. Once upon a time, a veiled attack, but now an attack exposed and out in the open. An attack upon an institutionalized way of speaking about the world. Going further, the outrage may be caused by what is actually said and done, as well as by what is actually not said and not done, and by implications perceived as unwholesome consequences. Here's the formula, folks. If we admit X, then Y and Z are sure to follow. So, if the Israeli state is a genocidally racist ethnocracy, then cuts in funding and rejection by the United States must follow.